let me present a model that I think captures a lot of what we see in terms of household financial management when we go to the field in developing countries. Any exercise around financial management needs to start with understanding of the income flows of the household. And it's useful to array them by how regular that income is. We can define regularity in terms of the frequency of the payments, but also on how predictable the payments are. So on the left, we're going to be putting daily income, the kind of count on. On the far right, we're going to be putting windfall income that you weren't quite expecting, and in between, we'll put everything else. The other thing that one needs to have a sense of is the nature of the goals that families have. And this we can array by how extraordinary those goals are. By extraordinary, what we mean is how large are the chunks of money that are required to meet them, but also how regularly is that money required. If it's a very recurring thing, it's not very extraordinary. So on the left, we're going to be putting things like food, which are small amounts having provided frequently. At the far end, we're going to putting land and permanent home aspirational goals like that. The household financial management problem is then to convert the income with this sort of characteristics into goals of this nature. And typically, households are going to go through a bunch of instruments or assets in order to achieve that. Here we put the more liquid sort of assets, which matches more regular income and expenditures, and here we put more investment type of assets that are more for the longer term. Based on this, then, we can establish what the general rules of the game are for household financial management. What we see is that households have two general types of objectives. The first one is to achieve a balance between regular income and routine expenses. We can show that in the picture here we can represent it by this arrow here. That this number, this regular income roughly meets the requirements for the household on a daily basis. If regular income is too low, of course, and the household has a problem, it needs to be eating into these longer term assets all the time and depleting them. But if the regular income is too high, that could also be a problem, because then you might be tempted to waste the excess income. The second objective that people have is to build some kind of buffers. These are stores of value, which are represented by this circle here, which are really for two reasons. In order to achieve larger goals, so this would be applying income from here, value from these assets to these more extraordinary goals out here, or possibly to meet emergencies. In order to achieve these two goals, to achieve balance on regular income and expenditures, and to build up value to achieve larger aspirations and emergencies, households follow a bunch of common strategies. One set of strategies we can call income shaping. This is about changing the array of income on this dimension here. So we can mention one concrete strategy to be lumping. That's about turning regular income, in effect turning it into a windfall income. And you do that, for example, by participating in a Rosca. So you're contributing regular income into that Rosca, and once in a while you get you get the full pot of money from the whole community, and this comes as a big lump. It feels like a windfall. Another type of income shaping strategy is routinizing income. And in fact, it's the opposite. This is about the opposite case. Number 3, lumping, is where you have excess regular income that you want to package up into longer term assets. The routinizing income is the opposite situation, where you have a deficit in regular. You don't have enough regular income. You want to create more regular income. And so what you would do in that case is to invest this pool of assets, or a part of it, into assets that produce a regular return. So this is about the buffer being invested in productive assets. Those assets might still be part of the buffer, but in addition, they're contributing to regular income, and that's, for example, investing in a cow. The other common strategy that we see is that, to the extent that there's windfall income, this tends to be applied directly to the buffer. Households don't want to feel like they're living day to day on windfall income, because that windfall income is not assured. It happens too infrequently, so it's better to not have to tap into this windfall income if they can avoid it. Of course, if they need to create more regular income, then they'll use this windfall to buy that cow, which then is routinized under point 4 here. A second family of strategies that families commonly employ revolves around how they resolve goals. In other words, how do they figure what are the goals that they want to achieve here? We've mentioned here that there's a bunch of routine expenses, which represent the goals at the non-extraordinary end of the spectrum here. Equally, there's a bunch of goals out here that they might have. What we typically see is that these goals out here are generally not that well defined. People tend to look at them as a collection of goals, or a fuzzy goal, where the individual uses of that goal, or the individual applications, are not necessarily yet clear. And what we see is that there's, from time to time, these fuzzy goals get converted into salient goals. In other words, they're individualized and made more apparent. So this goal, for example, I might decide to take it out of here and treat it on its own. That is largely, in my mind, going to be accompanied with a parceling off of some of the assets here, whether physically or only mental, and that's, of course, the resources that I'm reserving to apply eventually to fulfill this goal here. What triggers the resolving of the fuzzy goal into individual salient goals? That happens fairly infrequently, but there's two key drivers. One is the proximity to event. A lot of these goals here are life cycle event driven. Like, for example, a marriage. If the marriage is upon us, we need to individualize that goal in order to focus absolutely on it. So one factor is time to event, and the other one is the size of buffer. If the buffer, I feel, is getting large enough for the buffering needs that I have, I can actually start thinking about how to use some of the money that is in there, and at that point I'm going to decide to buy a TV. The other way to resolve a goal is to routinize it via debt. So this might be a goal for a bicycle that I might have here, but instead of working harder towards it, what I can do is routinizing it, which means I take on debt by the bicycle. At this point, the bicycle stops being a goal because I already have it, and my routine goal now becomes to clear that debt. I routinized the bicycle goal through debt. The third family of strategies that people employ is around materializing stored value as and when they need it. And they'll need it if they're out of balance. In other words, they might need to extract some value from this pool of assets here because one is not in balance here, or because they have an emergency, which is a big non-routine expenditure. In order to have this ready store of value that people can materialize for an emergency, they'll employ two kinds of strategies. One is to pick within here assets that are value from which it's easy to extract value. And what we mean by that is assets that you do not need to liquidate in order to extract value, and that's of course what you do when you pawn an asset or you borrow against an asset using the asset as collateral. You still have the asset, you've preserved the integrity of your pool of assets here, but you have effectively extracted the value because you've pawned the asset, and you'll need to repay that in order to retain full claim to that asset. An alternative is to pick assets here, not necessarily those that are easily pawnable or they can borrow against. Like for example, an example of that will be the jewel but rather to pick assets that you can sell easily and that you can reconstitute easily, quickly. An example of that might be goats. People would generally, in an emergency, would generally prefer to sell their goats than their cow, because they feel like goats, given their shorter lifespan and smaller purchase price, that if they have to sell the livestock, then they'll be able to build up towards the goat herd more easily, more quickly than if they had to do the cows, which present larger upfront cost to purchase and lower value appreciation or slower value appreciation over time. Whereas the goats you can readily sell within 3 months and then get a new one. So this then presents the general game that people play around their financial management. And of course, how this is played will depend on what exactly their desires are, the intensity of desires, and so on. But this is the general rules that we observe over and over again.